Hi there, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the material conditions for ordinary Soviet citizens between about 1928 and 1933. So, really, the duration of the first 5-year plan. Though we will delve back a little further than that. And we'll talk about two main things: food shortages and housing shortages, and really what those tell us about Stalinism. As I've mentioned previously, during the second 5-year plan and as a part of the Stakhanovite movement, there was a move towards trying to create Soviet consumerism, or trying to create a kind of a Soviet version of a state-led version of American-style consumerism. This was something that was quite close to Stalin's heart. So this was ultimately a desirable goal for Soviet society. But the first 5-year plan that focused on heavy industry really achieves the opposite and creates immense shortages of foodstuffs, of basic household items, and of housing. And it's housing that I want to talk about first. During the Civil War period, there was a policy of consolidation. This is the policy, really, of moving large numbers of poor working class families into middle class houses and apartments in the cities of Russia, places like Moscow and then Leningrad. There is a great deal of apartment living. This is the kind of the structure of inner city life for the bourgeoisie of the pre-revolutionary period, and I express ideological reasoning behind consolidation was to bring about an enforced equality, to give poor working class families accommodation in nicer middle class apartments, and really to the Soviet secret police and the administrators of the policy from the local municipal authorities had sort of barely disguised glee at humiliating the middle classes, though a great many of them were drawn from the middle classes themselves. And the policy of consolidation was part of Lenin's war on what he viewed as being the internal front. So a policy of degradation gradually of the lives and conditions of the middle classes in Russia, and a policy of kind of proletarianization of the middle classes, the combination of taking any surplus space from them, cramming large numbers of people into their apartments, many of whom were alien to them, their manners seemingly rough and crude, it seems an almost universal experience of the bourgeoisie just after the revolution who are consolidated, that their homes are wrecked, that there is cigarette smoke and drinking and wild parties, and things are broken, the carpets are wrecked, toilets are left in an unspeakable state, and there is a tacit encouragement to do this by the various organs of the Bolsheviks, various writings in papers, revolutionary papers, encouraging the proletariat to behave as aggressively and in a confrontational way to the bourgeoisie, the expropriators, as possible. A combination of this and forcing many of the middle classes to participate in forced manual labour was part of Lenin's idea to proletarianize the middle classes. After 1928, with the commencement really of the Stalin era and the Cultural Revolution, which is really a prelude to the 5-year plans, There's less of an overt ideological motivation for consolidation. Not that the Stalin and his contemporaries didn't share similar ideological goals. Of course, they did. It's simply that the bourgeoisie homes were consolidated a decade earlier. And that process has really been concluded. The period from 1928 onwards sees a massive increase in overcrowding, not because there really are any more bourgeoisie to torment and humiliate. The kind of ideological consolidation was at its height during the 1920s. No, the process of the overcrowding of the towns and cities really is firstly the result of the 5-year plans, as industrialisation sucks agricultural workers and peasants from the grinding poverty of the countryside into the towns and cities where there appears to be jobs and work, which is a process which is encouraged by the party. The the Soviet government does very little to provide new housing. This means that the housing stock that exists, some of it occupied by the former bourgeoisie, much of it occupied by the workers, sees an immense pressure put on it by huge influxes of people coming from the countryside and rooms having to be found in communal apartments. The Soviet idea of the communal apartment, some of which were now being built, but only really the new builds were only really happening in the new cities, places like Magnitogorsk, in many of the the established towns and cities that had existed for centuries. All that happens is that existing apartments get more and more subdivided. But anyway, the point about communal living was that the ideological point was that the Soviets believed it would lead to some kind of greater collectivism, that ultimately this is another one of the ways that Lenin believed that, people would be educated in socialism. They would be taught to share. They'd be taught to abandon this kind of fetishism for objects and possessions, and taught to forget the need for ownership and focus on more communal values. And this is one of the very kind of almost spiritual notions of Soviet communism, that you would finally free people from this oppressive relationship to things. Of course, that doesn't happen at all. In fact, it makes the situation far, far worse, as you have people crammed into flats where each individual has a couple of square meters to call their own. There is fierce demarcation of territory, as you would imagine. The utensils within kitchens are jealously guarded, and so are foodstuffs, and there's a huge increase in mental illness as a result of the policies of enforced consolidation and communal living. People have no privacy. They have to deal with all sorts of social problems that are imposed upon them. There's an immense amount of stress all the time. The exacerbating factor in all of this is the role of the state, in that individuals that are envious of one another, people that are resentful that a certain family has a bigger room, can constantly threaten to denounce them to the state, can constantly threaten to inform on them to the secret police and refer to them as counter-revolutionaries and class enemies and these sorts of things, and possibly kulaks and all sorts of frightening accusations in order to get the room off them, or in order to settle some kind of petty score. So this is not really the kind of socialist, communal, harmonious living that Lenin had in mind. In some apartments, there are new paper-thin walls are put in. In others, rooms are simply simply partitioned by a clothesline and some old sheets. The result of having people forced together cheek by jowl is that there is the surveillance state doesn't really need to do much work. Instead of having a surveillance state, you have a surveillance society. So society is spying on itself, and its primary relationship is with the state, which is the source of all power and economic output, and therefore it makes it easy to create a society of informers. As far as foodstuffs and essential items go, the 5-year plans had presented another dilemma. The end, once again, of private trade and private ownership, and the resumption of largely war communism-esque policies as regards ownership goes, had resulted in a total loss of artisans within Russian towns and cities. So in the 1920s and prior to the revolution, an enormous percentage of economic output and manufacturing output in Russia had been provided by artisans. These are people not working in large factories, not working on production lines, but craftsmen who are able to make bowls and plates and knives and forks and coats and jackets and shoes. Shoes are this immensely sought after commodity, real gold dust in Stalin's Russia, because there are simply no cobblers. They've either been forced into some kind of forced labour scheme, or they have been criminalised in some way as a petty bourgeois, or they have simply just abandoned what they do in a bid to avoid the attentions of the state. Government-run food shops have a monopoly on the food supply. The only problem is that many of them don't manage to supply anything at all. There is a perennial problem, and this is something that is seen all the way up to the end of the Soviet Union, of empty shelves. The stores that are not part of any kind of market economy, and instead receive their cues directly from the state, are notoriously badly run and unreliable, and the conditions that exist for Soviet citizens in that first 5 years, 5-year plan, are frequently close to not exactly outright starvation, though if you're in the countryside, particularly in the Ukraine, it's absolutely like that. But in many of the towns and cities, there's constant hunger, and the period of the first 5-year plan in terms of hunger is far more acute than most of the 1920s. There are it is one of the periods of most intense economic hardship, particularly regarding food, in the history of the Soviet Union. Queuing becomes a regular practice under the first 5-year plan. There are frequent stories of people starting queuing at 2 a.m. In the small hours, so that they can get a couple of loaves of bread when the store opens at 6 a.m. The queues see people freeze to death, particularly during Soviet winters, and there's frequent violence and explosions of public anger when the store opens and people have been queuing for 4 hours and there's nothing there. I think one of the things that's really interesting and really starts to change that view, that common held view of the Soviet society, that everyone was extraordinarily well behaved because they were too terrified to do anything else. There are bread riots during the 5-year plans, and constant outpourings of anger and cursing of the Soviet government, and people between 1928 and 1933 at least have a capacity to do this. It'd be interesting, and this will be some further reading on my part, so I'll get back to you on this one, what the situation is like later on at the height of the Great Terror. I'd suspect something quite different. But at least in this initial phase of the first 5-year plan, there is plenty of evidence of dissent. And one of the explanations that's come up with by the Soviet citizenry, particularly the very engaged Soviet citizenry, the activists of things like the Komsomol and the Young Pioneers and party members, but also not just the citizenry but the bureaucracy and the leadership. There is a constant refrain that they have when food doesn't wind up in the stores. This utopia that Soviet citizens should be living in, the fact that it hasn't materialised is that somebody somewhere is sabotaging it, that somebody is to blame for things that are constantly going wrong, because that can be the only explanation. The possibility that an economic and political model has been decided upon, which is proving to be flawed and proving to not supply material gains in the way that it was predicted. This is something that's kind of too dangerous too fraught with the possibility of kind of individual and collective crisis. It's too dangerous to entertain. So the hunt for saboteurs, the hunt for wreckers, is constantly on, and there are fanciful stories of bourgeois and kulak conspiracies to destroy foodstuffs. When shoddy and unpleasant foodstuffs wind in the stores, such as the classic loaf of bread with the rat baked into it, that kind of thing. That this must be the work of wreckers, and there are arrests and trials based upon this. Much as with the 5-year plans, where you have things like the engineers, the bourgeois specialists trial and the Shakti trial, and these kinds of things. And during the first 5-year plan, this is a way of explaining why the revolution wasn't panning out in the way that it had been anticipated. There's of course one major cause for food shortages during the 1930s and during the 5-year plans, and that was the fact that the Soviet Union was a net grain exporter. The reason for this exporting of grain overseas was that it was the only way that Stalin could conceive of being able to raise enough capital to industrialize Russia. This is how you pay for your factories, your machines, and your vehicles. This is something that Stalin is insistent on continuing with, even at a time of mass famine in the early 1930s. One of the interesting facets of Stalin's food policy, and particularly as it pertains to the wider economy, is that of vodka. Vodka was seen by the party as being a very bad thing. It was synonymous with the old, violent, backward world of the Russian peasantry, something, as I've mentioned before, that the Bolsheviks have very little time for, and was obviously quite rightly implicated in poor work standards, domestic violence and every other vice that Soviet society was hopefully going to eliminate. But one of the things about vodka was its vast tax-raising potential, and the government with Stalin had to concede that trying to promote kind of temperance or abstinence from alcohol was something that the Soviet Union could not afford to do. And by the mid-1930s, vodka is accounting for something like a quarter of all tax revenues in the Soviet Union. It is used as a means, very much like modern governments around the world do, of raising huge sums of revenue. So the economic realities of that really do tell us quite a lot. So what can we conclude from this? Well, I guess the thing that really stands out here is that the 5-year plans themselves have an enormous distorting effect on the economy and on Soviet society. The ability to provide basic foodstuffs is undermined because of a restriction or an elimination of basic market trade, which was essential for the 5-year plans in order for them to work. And also there is very little consumer production during the first 5-year plan, because everything is diverted towards the needs of heavy industry. This is the reason why so few houses are built and so many people have to be crammed into so many small apartments, is because the Soviet government is building factories, not tower blocks. So the breakneck speed of industrialisation, which does happen extremely rapidly and has huge far-reaching consequences for the Soviet Union, this has unintended social and economic ramifications for ordinary Soviet people. But Stalin was able really to lift his mind from these things. It's not that he was deliberate in lowering living standards for the majority of Soviet citizens, though I'm sure he was quite happy to do so for the former bourgeoisie and the kulaks. But the majority of Soviet citizens, where he saw his power base residing, he believed that it was his role, in point of fact, to actually elevate their condition, but was quite ambivalent about this when, indeed, it turns out that he takes the Soviet Union through a prolonged period of hardship and poverty. And during the second 5-year plan, as I've mentioned previously, when a consumer economy begins, it's not a reality for most Soviet citizens. It's a reality for a lucky few. Anyway, I hope you found that useful, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.